And also to answer your question, Laura, we gave an additional 25 tickets to the town of Richlands as well for that performance.
Ginger, what is the date of that?
It's the 18th at 3 o'clock at Richlands Middle School.
February 18th,
Yes,
3 p.m.
yes.
RMS.
Actually, I have that stuff right here to give you all.
Okay. That's okay. Ginger, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We
You're welcome.
appreciate it so much.
Okay, and at that point, I would encourage, if you're available, I will make it a point. Yes, I'll try to make it a point to be there on the 18th, okay? And if we could all be there, it'd be really 3 p.m. at the middle school.
It's on these little cards, too.
Okay. Thank you, thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Philip Horton. Philip, are you here? Philip? Is Philip here? Have we had a call from Philip? Do you know? No one? Okay. We're sorry we missed you, Philip. Next is Jim Ribble. Jim, you're from the law firm, right?
I'm
Surveyor.
Alpha Land Surveyors.
Oh, I misunderstood, sorry.
Representing Travis Hackworth, his company, Appalachian Capital Investments. I don't know if you all are aware, but he recently purchased the old Magic Mart building and had us to survey it. And when we did, we found out the east property line is right against his building, which is on the side that the town owns, looks like a storage lot. And the property line's right against their building, and they don't have enough room to get around to the back of the building. If I could bring these sketches up for you all to look at.
That's fine. I just want to remind you, it's 5 minutes, but you're fine. Come on up, come on. Thank you.
He's requesting that you all convey, sell, or whatever you all pleasure, this little strip of land that would give them enough room to get around the side of their building. The line closest to the building, this is the building, is the existing property line.
This line right here?
That's the building line. This is the existing property line.
Okay.
You see it touches the building on this side. This is an existing fence that you all, this town has already built.
Right here,
Yes.
okay?
And what we'd like to do is have you all convey that little strip that's shaded in pink, so that they'll have enough room to get around the building, and it really doesn't change anything as far as the property that you all are using right now.
Okay. Yes. Is that your request?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Ribble, I will be the will of the council. My suggestion is usually things like this go before the planning commission to study the land and the layout. And if council is amenable to that, my suggestion is to have the planning commission look at this.
Sure.
And they can report to us at the next meeting.
If the council doesn't have any objection to maybe conveying that with the approval of the planning commission, I'd go ahead and fix the final plat that'll have the meets and bounds and the actual area. It's actually a little bit less than 1/10 of an acre. It's not very much, so.
I would suggest, and I understand conveyance and buying and selling, but I would suggest that you present that at the planning commission meeting.
Okay.
And that meeting will be the first Tuesday of the month. I don't have my calendar with me. Is it still at 7:30, Heather?
First Tuesday of March?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Is that okay with the council?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Would you guys entertain maybe an easement instead of conveyance, like?
Well, if, the only problem with that is if Mr. Hackworth wants to sell the property, it kind of puts makes it more difficult to sell the property with the line against the building like that, and I'm sure they'd rather own it than have an easement, but, you know, whatever. I think if the council weren't inclined to convey that property, then maybe that's an option.
Okay. Anything else, Doug?
No, that's it. Thank
Anyone
you.
have, is council amenable to referring this to the planning commission for their study? Okay.
Well, Mayor, I would also just My request when I got a call from Mr. Gooch was to have somebody present that to where if you all would even want me to look into this at all, to refer it to legal as well, because obviously this isn't going to be something as simple as just conveying it over. There's certain things that the town does have to do. So obviously it's council's call. Would you all want me to spend any time on this?
I think the commission would greatly appreciate your input as our attorney and our legal counsel at Bob's Land, and I think that would be really important. And Mike, if you are so inclined, you might, and I will defer to Heather on this, and you want to talk with the commission, and then you could relate to us, and they could relate to us what they think.
Is
Heather?
that a consensus of council?
Consensus?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Doug, pass that to Mark, so he'll have that.
Heather, did you have something you
Well, I
wanted?
was just gonna say, I did check the calendar, and that is, the 7th at 7:30.
Okay, thank you, Heather.
Okay,
So-
so we should call and have this put on the agenda then?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You can give it to Heather, and she'll give it to the chairman of the commission.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Keep this in my stack. Okay. Okay. I should have asked for this, and I'm very sorry. Is there anyone in the audience or in the hall who would like to speak on any issue coming before the council directed to town business, nothing personal? Anybody who wants to speak to the council? Okay. Apparently, no one wants to speak, so the opportunity has been presented, and we thank you very much. Let's go to Roman numeral 8, agenda items. Now, this does not involve a time limit. How do you say your last name?
Laux, L-A-U-X.
Is it a French name? That's all right. I'm interested in things like that, and I always have been. Okay, thank you. Mr. Laux, Kyle Laux with Davenport Financial Review. Yes, sir.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Mayor, and I have a handout, so if you will, I will bring those around briefly as I introduce myself. Hello. Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Thank you.
And again, Mr. Mayor, members of council, nice to see everyone this evening, and appreciate the opportunity to be before you this evening. So, a little bit of introduction. I don't know how much of this you have had, especially knowing I think some of the council is relatively new after the last election. So, again, Kyle Laux with Davenport. I'm out of our Richmond office, but we work across the state and across the region. And what we really do on behalf of local governments across really the Commonwealth and a lot in your area is serve as what we'll sometimes call a financial advisor. And so what that means is we are an independent outside entity. We are not auditors. We are not a bank. So we're not providing loans or anything that variety. What we're really doing is helping local governments like Richlands, like others, sort of think, plan, strategize about your financial well-being as a local government. And so I just make that little, sort of introduction on the front end. We work very, very closely with, I think, all of your neighboring counties and a number of your neighboring jurisdictions. I personally work closely with Tazewell County and the Board of Supervisors over there, which is sort of how I came to be introduced to your town. We were asked towards the, at some point during the last calendar year to do what we call a financial review. And that is to come in, again, as an independent outside entity and take a look at where you have been as a town in terms of finances, get a sense of some of the critical variables, and give some advice, some recommendations based on best practices, not just in terms of what happens, in our neighborhood here, but what happens across the country. And so we call that financial review. again, what we have in front of you this evening. And so we've been working on that over the last several months, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to present this to you. I think the intent here is that there's no specific actions per se of council, but we do a lot of this time of year, knowing that you as a public body in your fiscal year are in the budget planning process, no different than any of your peers, counties, cities, et cetera, across the state. So with that as a little bit of an introduction, I'll go page by page here, try to move it relatively quickly, being mindful of time, but certainly as there are questions as we're walking through this, I'm happy to answer them. So again, on page one, I think that background there, I won't reiterate that, but what is somewhat unique about the town, again, versus a county, is that you have your general fund and then you have your enterprise funds. And so we tend to think about those very, very separately. That's a best practice in terms of how you think about public finance across the country. Your auditors and our accountants will account for those things separately. And so we kind of start with that as an underlying assumption, that our general fund is going to be separate from our enterprise funds, meaning our water, our sewer, and our electric. So again, at the bottom here, we really are seeking to give you some guidance, some advice, some recommendations on what we can tell, again, as outsiders. It's the first time we've been in front of you, which we certainly appreciate, and have been able to work with Heather to get a variety of the financial information from your audits and different documents, et cetera. So with that, we'll start with the general fund. We very purposely divided this up between the general fund and the enterprise funds. So we'll start with the general fund side of things. We've been able to look at over the last 5 years, really your audited financials. So what we've been provided is, again, FY17 to FY 2021. So as the FY 2022 audit comes out, we'd be happy to kind of refresh what we see in here, because it's going to be very important. So it's a little bit old numbers in terms of 21, but it starts to paint a picture in terms of some trends we can point out to you. Over that time period, your property tax revenues, they've been largely flat. No significant growth, but no decline either, so kind of steady state on the property tax side of things. You have seen, though, and we'll show you some of these numbers, your other local taxes have grown, on average about 5% a year. That tells us that from a local economy standpoint, some of those things are indeed growing. The meals tax, the sales tax, we've seen that across the state. We've seen that in your region in terms of some of those local discretionary taxes, people going out to eat, buying things, some of the Amazon delivery tax that you get. That's all been helpful to local governments. And that's been your driver, at least through the end of 2021, in terms of growth in your general fund revenue base. The expenditures we'll talk a bit about in more detail as we go through here. But something we want to note here in the fourth bullet point down is, as we take all these revenues and expenditures together and kind of boil it up, we have seen a trend in the general fund of deficits. And so, simply stated, the revenues that the town is bringing in has not been fully covering the expenditures, whether those be capital or operating, on the general fund side of things. So again, using your audits to see that information, it's a trend. We're going to show you that to you visually. Last bullet point there, FY22 audit, that'd be your numbers as of the end of last June. As we understand it, not complete yet. I think it'd be an important piece to the puzzle in terms of maybe fleshing some more of this out. You are not alone in having some of those audits be sort of working their way through the process. A lot of auditors for the moment are relatively understaffed. There's a bunch of new GASB pronouncements they're working through. So with that, again, I think I'd offer to the mayor and council, as some of that information comes out, we can refresh some of this, but wanted to provide you tonight what we have thus far. Page number 4, in terms of your assessed value. So this is your primary revenue generating tax base within the town. We like to take a little history of where that's been. It gives us a little bit of picture of where it's been to maybe give a sense of where we're going. And I think what you see there is we've been pretty flat, been pretty stable, not a lot of growth, but certainly not much decline either. So I think I saw some things on the agenda, maybe in terms of economic development. There's a lot of new federal dollars by virtue of these stimulus acts that have gone out, and so we're seeing some of that get put to use. But for the moment, I think what we see is a relatively flat revenue-producing tax base there, and you see that on the table at the bottom. If you flip the page to page number 5, this again gets to our historical performance in the general fund in terms of finances. And what we really mean by that is when we go take all the details that are in the back of this book and say, what are our total revenues versus our total expenditures, again, just for the general fund. We've been maybe break even, but really even sort of eating into our reserves over that time period. And so we highlight that in red. We've had a surplus as per your audits through 2021 in one of those prior 4 years. 2022, we understand there were some taxes that were adjusted, increases, et cetera, so we would be curious to see what those look like as the 2022 numbers come out. I think our expectation is maybe it looks a little more favorable, but for the moment, based on the information we have, on the general fund side, we really have been eating into our reserves and our savings account over that past 4 or 5 years. So we take that and flip to page number 6, our general fund balance. Many of you, you may be familiar with this term, you may not. I'll give it a second to me introduce it. This is, and again, not accountants, more finance people, but this is kind of our savings and our checking account combined in the general fund. So we as individuals, you know, you have your operating account whereby you're paying your bills and monthly bills, et cetera. If you're fortunate enough to have some savings off to the side. In addition to that, what we see here for the general fund is this fund balance concept is pretty much analogous to that checking account and savings account kind of concept. We note at the top of the page here that fund balance, and we say this arguably the most important finance-related metric or measurement, whatever term you want to use there, but it's a very, very important measurement to outside entities, whether it's banks, whether it's rating agencies, whether it's lenders or the state entity, in terms of what we look like in terms of a financial basis. And so we note here in the second bullet point, it's really a best practice nationally to certainly have some dollars in that general fund reserve and to have something in the realm of maybe 16-17% of your annual expenditures in reserve in the general fund. And we note that the GFOA is the National Governmental Finance Officers Association. That's really their recommendation nationally, is to have about 16-17%, is really kind of a couple months worth of call it reserves set aside for that. What we've seen by virtue of the town's audits, again, through 2021, is we in fact even have a negative balance in the general fund. And so that was one of the first things that really, in fairness, jumped out to us. That's unusual to see that. Granted, we'll get to the enterprise funds, and so there is some intermixing here between how the general fund and the enterprise fund maybe are kind of helping each other out in that instance. But from a pure, how would you typically think about running a local government, it's very unusual to see a negative general fund balance sort of running over multiple years. So we wanted to make sure we pointed that out to you as a council. Again, with some of the changes that have been occurring in FY 2022, we'd be curious to see where that ended up. I think the hope is maybe that's more positive. We don't know that right now, just haven't seen those numbers. We thought that was very important to point out to the council. And I think as we go through the next couple of pages, we have some ideas and some recommendations to you. Obviously up to you as a town and a council for some ways to maybe think about rectifying that. We always like to, where we can, bring some, ideas and solutions to some of the problems we may find. So we'll talk about the next couple of pages, but this is arguably, from a general fund standpoint, unusual and something we'd recommend that you pay a lot of attention to going forward as you think about your budget. Page number 7. We list here why the fund balance is important. If you look in your audit, there's a number of different classifications of fund balance. It's kind of getting down into the the weeds, so to speak, but of primary importance tends to be what's called the unassigned fund balance. And you can really kind of think about that in simple terms as the rainy day reserve, if you will. That's kind of your savings account in the general fund side of things. So we list here some reasons that it's important to have that unassigned fund balance. I think I'll talk about just a couple of those. Number one, it's giving you good month-to-month cash flow. I think as you operate as a town, you obviously have the utility funds that are very large relative to what the general fund is doing on a relative basis. And so you have some of the utility fund cash flow to help out with that first bullet point. But again, emergency situations, you want to have some of those dollars set aside for those emergencies, unforeseen expenditures, and certainly to help with the cash flow side of things. An interesting thing that we are finding with clients really nationally is having a strong unassigned fund balance nowadays, especially in the last year, is ends up being a cost saver to the taxpayer. And the reason I say that is a couple-fold. So the first is from an interest rate perspective, and many of you may have seen this in your personal life or the headlines. Within the last year, interest rates have increased fairly substantially. What that has really meant is that if you have savings in a checking account or CDs, et cetera, you can actually start earning some real dollars on those saved monies within, whether it's a bank, a CD, et cetera. For you as a town, and this is the same goes for the county or anybody else, what that allows you to do is spin off some income that helps take some pressure off of other operating costs that, by virtue of inflation and other things that have happened the last couple of years, are certainly putting pressure on everybody's budget. And so I think amongst even these topic points that we note here, I'd leave you with the takeaway that having a strong fund balance from a taxpayer perspective really ends up being a money saver for them. One other point I'll make there is that when it comes time to borrow money for a capital project, no different than if you've gone to get a mortgage or a car loan or anything else, the bank or the lender is going to want to go look and say, okay, what does the balance sheet look like of that entity that I'm going to give a loan to? And so the stronger that fund balance, the better you as a town look to potential lenders, and thus the lower the interest rate you're able to garner when it comes time to have to borrow for needed capital projects. So if we leave you with one takeaway on the fund balance side of things, it's very important in our perspective, and it does end up being a money saver for the taxpayer versus the other way around. Flipping over to page 8, in terms of the fund balance policy, we've made a recommendation here that you think about putting in place a minimum general fund policy of 16% of your general fund revenues. It's about $900,000, $1 million, plus or minus somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit more as your 22 numbers come in. But that would basically be able to put you within, again, best practices. It would give you some reserves against some of those emergencies. It would also allow you to start sort of generating some of that interest income to help offset other expenditure pressures in the budget. If you flip the page to page 9, I mentioned that what we've tried to identify here, again, we're doing this as outsiders for the moment, so you may have other thoughts and ideas and et cetera, but ARPA funding for all of our clients across the state, the whole region, the country really, has been a very interesting variable the last several years. I presume you as a council are familiar with what those dollars are. All kinds of different restrictions on what they can be used for by virtue of the federal government. But I think what we've found is that with some of the newer sort of releases with the federal government, there is some flexibility to use some of those dollars as what they call revenue replacement. That's kind of a federal regulation term that I won't go into the exact details, but it looked to us, based on some of the information Heather shared with us, that you'd have an opportunity to take some of these dollars in terms of the ARPA, and certainly you've allocated certain portions of them to certain projects, but take a balance of it and use that to really help shore up the general fund. To the extent that's possible, it would save you during the budget cycles from having to kind of work your way out of that negative fund balance by virtue of increasing other revenues, kind of give you a call it a one-time shot in the arm and get the ship kind of leveled there in terms of the general fund balance. So that's a thought, an idea, maybe a recommendation we have for you, obviously up to the council to make that determination. But again, based on what we saw in terms of the negative general fund balances historically, and knowing that these ARPA dollars are substantial for a town like Richlands, that there's an opportunity there to kind of help right the ship while doing a variety of other projects that you have identified. We tried to lay that out in a little bit of a flow chart here. If there's about $5.4 million in total ARPA funding that Richlands received, as we understood it, about $2.2 million of that sort of already allocated towards other things. And so if we were to take about $1.2 million in that green sort of section in the middle, use that to basically get our fund balance back up to zero, and then maybe get it back up to that recommended policy level, that would still leave you about $2 million, at least from the information we saw, to do other things with, knowing you've got other capital projects. So again, an idea, a recommendation we have for you. We know this time of year for everybody, it's the budget cycle and sort of getting your hands around what really are the cash flows and the capacity to do different things that you as a town want to do. We know inflation is going to impact that, and so using some of these ARPA dollars as kind of a, call it one-time shot in the arm, may give you an opportunity to take care of that fund balance side of things, but also be focused on what you're trying to accomplish going forward within the budget. We'll flip the page here, and again, we're sticking with the general fund for the moment. Mr. Mayor, and I'll try and keep this moving to be mindful of time, but on the debt side of the equation for the general fund, what we saw is about $730,000. Really 3 different loans on the general fund side of things. Interest rates are pretty reasonable. There's not a lot of debt on the general fund. So again, as an outside sort of entity taking a look at Richlands for the first time, it's the first time in a long time, the general fund does not have a lot of debt outstanding. It looks like it's all fixed rate. You can see the payments there on the right-hand side in terms of the graph. It's paid off all within the next basically 7, 8 years. And you have some decline coming up between FY24 and FY25. So if you take a look at this and say, where are pressure points in terms of the general fund balance, clearly we've talked about that. We don't see a big pressure for the moment in terms of the existing debt on the general fund. Next couple pages will give you just a snapshot, staying with that general fund debt theme. Give you a couple ratios that as you work your way through the budget process, we'd recommend thinking about adopting formally as policies. These are going to be very commonplace for local governments across the region, across the country, to have these policies. And what they help you do as a council, as a finance department, is put in place some road markers, if you will, some benchmarks. So as things inevitably come up on the general fund that need to be done, maybe need to be financed, helps give council, the public, your staff a sense of what is reasonable, what is responsible in terms of taking on new debt when it's required and authorized by council. So the first is debt versus assessed value. You can see your debt versus assessed value in the right-hand graph. It's not a mistake. It's so small that it's barely perceptible on that graphic there. So again, you have a low debt burden on the general fund side, and that provides you some capacity. Page 12, if you flip the page there, this is arguably the more important of those 2 debt metrics and debt policies that we typically think about. This is tax-supported debt service versus expenditures. So what this is really showing us is how many pennies out of every dollar in the budget on the general fund side are going to make a debt service payment. You can see on the left-hand side there, we've listed some typical industry criteria. Anything below 8%, or 8 pennies on a dollar in the budget, is viewed as very strong. You are less than 3% right now. So again, as we kind of talk through on the general fund side, where are our pressure points, this is one of those examples that we use to say, do we have an issue per se with the amount of debt? And the answer is no, not on the general fund side. You're at about 3%. That's a very low level, relatively speaking. It's a responsible level. if the council were so inclined during your budget process, we'd recommend you put in place some policies here. Maybe keep yourself below 8-10% in terms of an upward, sort of ceiling on the amount of debt service you take on as a proportion of the budget. So with that, Mr. Mayor, on page 13, some summary observations in the general fund. Again, at the risk of repeating myself too many times, building that general fund balance, we, again, as outsiders, but we do this a lot in a lot of different places, we think that's very important. Using the ARPA monies gives you an opportunity to do that without having to look elsewhere in the budget. We know that there was revenue that was raised in FY 2022. Again, as your 22 audit is finalized, I think we'd like to see those numbers with your collective blessing and maybe refresh some of this just to give us a little fresher sense of what those numbers look like. And that'll be very interesting to see. And then lastly, number 4, on the general fund side of things, your outstanding debt is modest. We're not over-leveraged, at least as we see it. We gave you some of those benchmarks. So with that, I'll pause before we go to the next section. Any questions, Mayor or Council?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I hope that when we get the 22 figures, that the increases in our real estate taxes will help things.
Certainly.
Which you don't have, and we don't have it exactly yet. I do have a question. It's on page 9. Page 9.
Yes, so the
Yes,
ARPA
Kyle.
flow chart there? Yeah.
Yes, on the flow chart.
Yep.
It says 2.2 million, I guess that's what you mean, previously allocated spent. Now, I would have to have my memory refreshed on how that's gone, but I just want to draw my attention to that.
I'll answer that for him.
Okay, thank
So basically, he's going off of like when we did the chart, and that's what I sent him
Yes.
at the time. And we don't have the numbers from this audit yet, so it's anticipated that we will use some of that within that year as
Okay.
well. So basically, that's what he's going off of. He doesn't have anything else per se yet to really tie that to, and that's why he can only put previously.
Okay. Thank you, Heather.
What
Thank you.
type, Heather, I'm sorry, what type of debt is that?
No, well, it's not really debt. It's just what we used ARPA money for, or was planning to use ARPA money for. So some of the things that we had initially planned, not necessarily have we made any action on yet. So he wouldn't know that because he can only see what we have in the anticipated spending for the ARPA money.
So we still have 5.4 million?
I doubt we have 5.4 million, but there's only certain things that you can go and use the ARPA money for. So, in the midst of all that, what we were going to use it for was some upgrades at the water plant. I mean, I don't have that information in front of me, but it was a chart that came out with the budget at the same time. And some of that money will be used to supplement some of the wages because of it kind of just frees up the money to use other ways that way if we're going to use that way. I couldn't tell you exactly. I mean, we've obviously said it several times. They've mentioned, well, we could use ARPA money for that. I mean, but necessarily have we done that yet? I couldn't. I don't necessarily know until we get the final numbers back.
Does that include the million from Thompson Litton? That,
Well, that's part of those upgrades, and no, I can't remember, to be honest with you, Doug. I can't remember what it said. I know it had water and sewer upgrades on it, but I don't know what you're speaking to with Thompson Litton
Well-
Engineering.
the study they did,
I know what you're talking about. I just
Yeah.
don't know when it says water sewer upgrades, if it's earmarked for that particular thing. You know what I'm saying?
sure.
It just says upgrades.
gotcha.
Yeah, to Heather's point, what we were going off of, we've got some detail in the back. Page 31, right or wrong, there's some detail back there. I don't know if you want to dive into all that, but that's what we were working off of for the moment. I think one observation we'd make with the ARPA dollars, and this is global, not just to Richlands, but those are grant dollars, right? So those are grant dollars from the federal government, and using those dollars towards one-time purposes is really kind of how we'd recommend you think about that. And so putting them towards a purpose, whether it's a capital purpose, maybe upping the fund balance, that's really, in a best practice way, the way you would think about using those ARPA dollars. Because again, it's grant dollars, it's come in, they're one time, they're not coming again. And so making sure that those one-time dollars are matched up relative to one-time needs, as opposed to maybe funding things that have a recurring nature to them. And thus, once you spend them the first year and you look and say, all right, what are we going to pay, where's that money coming from the next year? Those dollars are already gone. So they can make that one global observation to council if that's helpful.
Does anyone else have questions at this point?
I do have a quick question. In referencing page 8, how did you arrive at 16%?
Yeah, so the 16%, it's a kind of a long-standing, call it nationally used benchmark. It really is designed to give you a couple months' worth of reserves, and that's really the thought process behind it. A lot of local governments will have even a higher level than that.
Of course.
Have a policy of maybe 20% plus. And so the 16% is, again, kind of a tried and true benchmark. It's been used for a long time across the country. Thinking about kind of where you're starting from, getting ourselves to that point seemed to make some sense. You'll see maybe bigger entities might have a 10 or 15% type of number, but for something of Richlands specific, that's really what our thought process was, if that's helpful.
So there's no recommended like multiplier for the small, like based on population or anything like that?
Not really, no.
Okay.
I'll tell you, higher is always better. So
Of course, within reason,
if we're
yes.
6-7 million in terms of the budget, getting yourself to about $1 million or plus or minus. Not necessarily a lot of science there per se, but
Okay.
having that range, and that's about what that 16+% equates to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, shall we move on?
Would be happy to. So I think we're on page 14 going into page 15. So again, purposely kind of put a little cover page in here, shifting gears from the general fund to the enterprise funds. And so enterprise funds, and many of you council public may already know this, but I'll just say it so it's sort of out there. Enterprise funds we think about differently than we do the general fund. That term enterprise kind of relates to business. You think about running an enterprise fund for a government kind of like you run a business. It's not exact, but that's sort of the terminology enterprise fund, and that's why we use that. What that really tends to mean is that for you Richlands between water, sewer, and electric, those funds should really be paying for themselves in a perfect world by virtue of the users that are using the underlying system. So the water users, the sewer, and the power, the ideas, all of that is a commodity. Water and the sewer all tied together, and the electric a commodity. And the amount you use, you pay more. You use less, you pay less. But ultimately, it is born within that system, that utility enterprise system, the cost of running and operating the system. And so we think about those separately, the general fund and the enterprise funds. That's, again, not just for Richlands, but broadly, globally, industry-wide practice.
A question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, happy to. Sorry.
Yeah. When you start mixing enterprise funds with the general budget, that's kind of risky.
It can be. There's nuances there. I think, broadly speaking, it certainly can be, because it can muddy the water there between what is supported by the general taxes and what is supported by those user rates of, whether it's electric, water, it's sewer, et cetera. Now, the nuance I'll point out, especially in a town the size of Richlands, and this is kind of broadly, is there's oftentimes shared costs within a utility. And so you, and I suspect this is the case, I don't know this, but you probably have folks that are doing a little bit of stuff for the general fund and a little bit of stuff for the water fund, or the electric fund, et cetera. So the nuance there is that you oftentimes see some of those costs accounted for and shared amongst the general fund and, for you, water, sewer, and electric. But they need to be, in a perfect world, accounted for separately. So for instance, and we see this in lots of different, I happen to work with a bunch of towns, so you'll see maybe like a town manager who is overseeing the town broadly. They have a salary, a portion of their day-to-day life is dealing with the general fund town matters, a portion may be dealing with their water and sewer fund, and so you may see that salary for a manager be distributed on a pro rata basis between what is accounted for within the general fund and accounted for within the utility funds. And so I point that out because that oftentimes is the case in towns across Virginia, whereby you have some of this sort of cost sharing. It's really to account for the fact that for an entity your size and scale, it probably doesn't make any sense to have a totally separate person running water and sewer versus, some other entities. And so you kind of divvy some of those costs out across those funds. But outside of some of that nuance, it can certainly kind of muddy the water to start combining general fund, electric, water, and sewer in your instance.
If you get over gel, if you've got to watch mixing those funds, wouldn't you agree that it's going to drive your electric rates higher, much higher, if you don't watch?
It could. I don't want to answer that too broadly because it can kind of go both ways depending upon how that's allocated or accounted for. But certainly it could.
Do you have a percentage of, are there any set percentage or close average that you should be taking out of that enterprise fund as towards your budget?
Can you give me a little bit more in terms of what you're
Okay.
what you're thinking about there?
I guess, what percentage should you take out of those funds to shore up your general funds? Are there a certain, a percentage you've got to watch out for?
No,
Like I'm saying, if you use like 20% to shore up that general budget, I think you'd run into problems as far as rate increases. That's what I'm getting at.
And I appreciate the question, Councilman Red. I wouldn't tie it just to a percentage. I would tie it to what are those transfers really going towards, and is there an allocable, realistic expense and sort of reason for those transfers. So I wouldn't tie it per se just to kind of a broad brush percentage. Is it 2%? Is it 20%? But are the underlying reasons, meaning some allocation of staff time or supplies or whatever it is that backing up?
Okay, if
some
your
of those?
firm looks at it, it depends on what those funds are used for. That's what you're telling me.
That's correct.
Okay. Does your company look at where those funds are going when you do the assessment? As of, say, $700,000-800,000 is taken out of the electric fund. Does your company track those funds, what they're used for?
No, I don't.
In your assessment?
In terms of what they're used for, not really, no. I mean, I think what you're alluding to is if there's dollars going from the electric fund to the general fund, then how are those dollars allocated?
Yes.
Yeah, and you see that oftentimes with cost allocations, you see that with pilot payments, it's a concept called the payment in lieu of taxes. It's relatively commonplace in utilities, whether it's water, sewer, electric. And I think having those be, again, I'll repeat myself a little bit, but tied to a rationale and sort of trackable is more important than in terms of what are those dollars used for on the other side. Meaning, once they make their way from the utility fund to the general fund, they tend to, in a lot of instances, just kind of be revenues of the general fund that are used for
If
broadly
you-
general fund purposes.
If you use shared funds, like that implies that it's used for personnel or expenses of the electric fund. If you say shared expenses. Okay, when you say that term, that alludes to that it should only be used for expenses of the electric fund and shouldn't be used for other projects. If you did that, I wish your firm would look at that, that's going to drive your electric rates sky high.
Got it. I appreciate it. I don't know as I can make that sort of leap entirely there, but I think what you're alluding to is if there are dollars that are coming out of the general fund, out of the electric fund and going to the general fund, is that going to be expense that is borne by the electric ratepayers? And that the answer to that is yes.
And if they're going to any other uses, that could be a problem as far as
could be.
driving rates up. Okay.
Got it. If that's helpful.
Anything else? Anybody? Okay. Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, so I think we've laid out on page 15 some of those other key considerations. Use of the system, pay for the system, sort of thinking about monitoring rate increases over a multi-year time period. That's something we end up doing a lot of this time of year, is thinking about how do we put in place a multi-year plan that sort of limits the surprises to ratepayers. So you can kind of think about a multi-year process to the extent rate increases are required. We know not often popular, but given the inflationary pressures that everybody is feeling right now within the operating budget, it's just kind of been right or wrong, not always popular, kind of a part of the process this time of year to be thinking about how do we adjust the revenues to take into account that things just cost more, whether it's utilities, chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. Similar concept in terms of maintaining reserves as well. Also very, very important on the general fund side, accounting for those reserves separately. You have some of those dollars in both electric and water and sewer. We'll show that to you. It's a much better situation than the general fund in terms of the reserves on those two funds. And so we'll point that out on the front end. We'd still recommend you put in place some policies related to that to kind of put some guideposts in place. But again, you start from a much better position in terms of water, sewer, and electric. So we start at the top of the page here. Again, working through 2021 numbers, water and sewer fund has solid reserve levels through 21. I think something we're aware of, we've gotten some details, and in fact even talked with the state about this, is some of the planned capital projects on water and sewer. And so as we think about what we've put in here for you, we've sort of have in the back of our heads that there are some major capital investments that you as a town are contemplating. And so what we saw through 2021 is taking on a material amount of new debt look to us to require more revenue on the water and sewer side, just to be kind of real blunt about it. And so, again, with some 22 numbers, we'd have a clearer picture of that. We know through some of our homework, so to speak, in terms of last year, the state has sort of offered or provided the opportunity to have both low-interest loans and grants. I think our recommendation to you, to the extent, this is your decision to make, we're not engineers and that variety, but to the extent those projects are going to move forward on the water and sewer side, we really would recommend that you, as a town, get in touch with the state. That's usually through the folks at the Virginia Resources Authority, VRA. They kind of help funnel the dollars for DEQ and VDH. DEQ tends to be the sewer side of the equation. VDH is the water side of the equation. I think we would recommend you as a town connecting with those folks because the loan